Hi class, welcome to chapter 10, Jim Crow and Ghettos, African Americans. So this chapter is going to be progressing the story of the African American community from last time. Last time we were looking at early U.S. history, the formation of the Middle Passage, early form, generational, plantation form slavery, etc. And then now we are moving into the kind of post-Reconstruction era into what is known as Jim Crow. And so we're going to be discussing what Jim Crow was, what kind of policies they were having in the South and other areas, and having a general discussion between the years of approximately 1900 up until, let's say, the Civil Rights Movement. And then for the third installment and section for our book, we're going to go off the sort of platform of the Civil Rights Movement and MLK, Malcolm X, and then kind of from there progress onto the rest. So today we will be discussing Jim Crow. So let's get started. If you have time, this is approximately, I believe, around 15 minutes or so. Please watch this wonderful TED Talk by James A. White. So this is a firsthand experience of the Jim Crow levels, of discrimination that he had to face. He was, in the military. He was, part of the Air Force, and they needed to get, moved around in order to get to whatever base or hometown they needed to get to. And so he was needing to transport his family from one part of the country to another, right? And as you do, you take your family with a road trip. And so he details and describes his experiences along that path. With, let's say, just stopping by motels, diners, and potentially obtaining some type of residence, right, in the new city that they're going to be living in. So it is a fascinating look, and especially towards the end of his talk, he discusses the conversations that he has with his grandchildren, right, and that conversation ties in with things that we are seeing more recently and modernly, right, with issues with police and such. And so it's a very interesting TED Talk, so definitely give it a watch if you have some time. But let's get into, perhaps one of the most famous, African-American athletes in the early 1900s, Jack Johnson. And so this individual has a very interesting history. Even Muhammad Ali later on would say something to the effect of, I might be bad, but this guy was crazy, right? He had the utmost respect for him. And so we will detail some of Jack Johnson's life, through boxing and him being pitted against the quote unquote white savior, or the big bad challenger, Tommy Burns. And so this was a Rocky level-esque showdown, if I've ever seen one. And of course we had the issues of race played in between, especially during Jim Crow. So Jack Johnson himself, nicknamed the Galveston Giant, he was a boxer during the Jim Crow era, and he was the first African-American world heavyweight boxing champion, right? He was finally, right, he attained that heavyweight belt, right? And that's not an easy feat to do. And so as he starts to go up and up into the ranks, he finally attains the world heavy belt. And he does so through defeating Tommy Burns. And so that was his sort of, apex competition. And so Tommy Burns was seen as, sort of the white answer to this kind of rising black superstar, because as you might imagine, in the Jim Crow era, especially in the southern states, they did not want to see a heavyweight champion being black. And so they, pitted all of their energies and all of their hopes and aspirations into Tommy Burns or whoever else would have been the white contender at the time. And so it's fascinating to look at some of the writings at the time of how people were describing, these fights. And so here, for instance, we see that, white fans were expecting Tommy Burns to defeat him, right, and defeat him soundly. And so they were writing such things such as, just hit the ape in the belly. This battle may in the future be looked back upon as the first great battle of an inevitable race war. And so, this boxing match and this boxing, showdown was not only just a, sportsman conduct or type of, event. People were truly, wanting, for Tommy Burns to win. And were putting this kind of race war ideology, right, kind of intermixed with it all. And so Johnson ended up, once he was fighting Tommy Burns, he proved to be the better boxer. And so he was like working him on the ropes, right, kind of toying with him, not really taking it too seriously because he didn't have to. He was the better fighter. And even though he demonstrated a higher level and capability in the ring, and he would just garner so much superstardom, we still had famous individuals such as Jack London. Jack London being a very famous author, but even Jack London starting to write, very, kind of racist campaigns against Johnson, saying there was no fight, no Armenian massacre could compare with the hopeless slaughter that took place, a grown man and a naughty child. And this is just, a very kind of limited taste of what some of the other things that Jack London would be writing about him during the time, and essentially saying that we need a white savior, right? We need somebody to challenge him and take him down from his pedestal. And so this was the fight, right, against Tommy Burns, that famous fight. And you can see here, Jack Johnson is, right, in fighting shape, fighting form, right? He's looking lean. And so he definitely ended up earning his title. These are some videos that I compiled from Jack Johnson and his, life, and they're very interesting. So, the top one is from a PBS documentary, so it's more of kind of like an informational documentary-esque type, detailing his life and some of the things he did, and winning the heavyweight championship, and also how he was, presenting himself around the world, and we'll get to that in a second. And the bottom left is Jack Johnson versus Jack London. Jack London being a very famous author, right? And, having all of these, hits, right? Novel hits. And the fact that Jack London was pitting against, Jack Johnson and writing so many scathing reviews about him, was a bit saddening and disheartening to see. But it just goes to show you, right? Doesn't matter what profession you're in. If racism is alive and well on your heart, you'll find a way. The bottom right, this was from 2016, I believe. Trump pardoned the late boxing champ Jack Johnson. So he was arrested, towards the, later years of his career, and thrown in jail. And the evidence points towards very kind of sparse allegations. And so the main thing that kind of pitted him into jail was essentially the judge just being extremely racist and just tossing him in there. And so Trump wanted to pardon this, very famous, right, figure. And he had a huge part in like early U.S., not early U.S., but like, Jim Crow 1900s-esque, right, that kind of era, athlete history, right? Black history. He was so popular. At one point in time, he was the most famous African American in the world. And so we had like commentators from both sides of, let's say, the political, or I should better say, both sides of the racial argument, right? So white commentators would be treating this fight and all of his other fights like national disasters, right? They need a great white hope to finally stand up and defeat him, right? The menace. And quotes such as, "Never before in the history of the ring has such a crisis arisen as that which faces the followers of the game tonight," right? Truly kind of just pitting a horrific view, right, on this fight, and God forbid if he wins, right, what would happen to the world. African-American commentators and supporters of him, even merely from an athletic perspective, right, were just saying, "No event in 40 years has given more genuine satisfaction to the colored people of this country than has the signal victory of Jack Johnson." So he was elevated essentially into a pedestal position because at that point in time, it was so difficult for African Americans to get into and compete against white athletes because there were so many barriers of entry. The fact that he literally just fought his way to the top and became the heavyweight and had the belt, and people could not really knock him off for a long time. Was just a testament to, right, number one, his athletic prowess, but also because he did become this like rallying cry symbol for African Americans in the United States and abroad at the time. He became so famous in the U.S. and abroad. He would, well, let's get into some of his post-fight actions here, right, to kind of describe some of the lifestyle that he had. He was very proud. He was very outspoken, similar to like an early Muhammad Ali type. He refused to accept racism. I mean, literally, he's beating white men with his bare fist, right? So there's a certain level of empowerment that comes along with that. He ended up breaking all racial barriers and married a white woman, gave her and adorned her the finest jewelry and clothes that money could buy. And especially as he was touring the United States and other countries abroad, he took her along, and on all of the press junkets, right, and photos together, he was dressed to the nines, right? She was dressed to the nines, and they were like hand in hand together. And so, you know, as I'm researching and studying his life and seeing all these photographs, you can really see that there is a very distinct intent, right, that he probably had with forming his persona, right, around the world. And so he definitely was, you know, giving this persona of, right, he's the #1 athlete, and he's going to, you know, flaunt his athletic, you know, ability, right, because he was really good. And on top of that, use his new platform to fight against any type of racism that he was seeing at the time, and try to break all of these molds and stereotypes. And he started becoming this huge, you know, folk hero, right? And during that crucial transition of Jim Crow, right, between the Civil War era and, let's say, into the 20th century, you know, folks were looking up to him and, you know, hopefully seeing a better kind of version of what life could be like. And so in comparison to what Jim Crow is going to be, and we'll get into what Jim Crow is, Jack Johnson ended up being the complete antithesis of it, right? Because if Jim Crow and all of the ideology and the policies of Jim Crow are saying things such as, you know, the Negro will never be able to, right, raise themselves out of poverty, or, you know, they are not as athletically you know, strong as us, right? They are inferior. They are this. They are that, right? Any kind of Jim Crow notions like that. He was completely and utterly proving them wrong at every step of the way. The fact that he was successful, right? He invested his money properly. He married a white woman. He breaking all racial boundaries and etiquette at the time. You know, becoming #1 in his field, and so he was essentially proving all of the naysayers wrong. And so, let's kind of look at. Oh, I think I had a couple photos here. Yes. So you know, he would be showing off photographs such as this, right? You know, him obviously with his wife and others, you know, his friends, and he would always be dressed, right, exquisitely. And later when they had amazing press junkets or anything else, like you could just tell here, he is dressed like almost like a Russian czar, right, with the fur and the coats and everything else. And his wife is adorned with the utmost beautiful jewels and all of the clothing that, you know, money can buy. He himself famously had a little bit of like an early grill, so he had front gold teeth to show off, right, additional wealth. So at that point in time, you know, even let's say anyone coming from Eastern Europe, right, or Jews or anyone else, they sometimes what you would do to hold on to your wealth, because sometimes the transition from Europe or wherever else is pretty dangerous. You don't want to just be wearing gold chains, right? You'll get mugged. And so a lot of times people were, let's say, having those like gold teeth, right, instead of like molars. Even today, sometimes you'll see like an older, you know, grandpa or grandparent or whatever. Maybe they'll still have like some gold tooth in there. It's from like an older custom of, you know, you would see people doing such a thing. But he took that and, you know, put it into a whole new level, kind of just displaying it, right, and flaunting it. And so he definitely was just trying to really make a public point, right, anywhere he could. And so as far as, you know, trying to put all of his actions into context, right? So let's get into and talk about what is Jim Crow, right? And so while the entire process of Reconstruction after the Civil War was, you know, an ideological attempt to heal the nation, right? And try to get past, you know, the huge, you know, long history of slavery. It obviously did not come to pass immediately, and it was it had a few roadblocks thanks to President Johnson. And so whatever the Reconstruction was supposed to be, it was pretty much a failure. Yes, we did have a number of wonderful amendments passed in the Constitution, right? Like, thank God for that, because at first you need to legally change, the country's laws in order to bring about actual change. And so we started getting, obviously, the very famous, right, Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation. After that, 13th Amendment citing no slavery. The 14th Amendment giving citizenship and equal legal rights. 15th Amendment, the right to vote without regard to color or /race. And other amendments that were passing. So although they were obviously very good and set legal precedents, there was a major sort of a major hurdle that was still to be passed. So the way I like to describe it in my classes to people is as such: if you want true change, as far as what I've seen in history, you can obviously disagree with me on this, but from what I've seen and studied, at the very first basic level, it starts with legislation, right? Especially in these types of issues. So first, they change the legislation from the top down, right? From the governmental federal level downward. So they change all the legal codes. And then after that, on the federal level, after that, the states need to fight amongst themselves in order on the state within the state and local levels to pass all of the laws to have, let's say, ultimate equality regardless of sex, race, gender, etc., whatever. And so that would be the next stage. The final stage for, let's say, true change in a society or a nation is the stage where we are in currently right now, in my opinion, in the modern day and age. So if you make all of the legal codes and everything in the legislation, right, as prim and proper as it should be, on the final bottom stage, that's when it takes generations for, right, the mindset to change, for people's mindsets to alter. And so that is much more difficult, and that's where like modern conversations of systemic racism are coming into play even for today. And so we still are in that generation, right, of that transitional generation of things getting better. I would argue things are definitely getting better than they were 50 years ago. So just imagine another 50 years or another 100 years, right? It takes time for the nation to heal. It takes time for the generations to kind of grow out of any old narratives. And so we had the passing of all of these federal legislations. And then because that initial federal top-down level, right, of change happened, that intermediate level of states that we were talking about, that is where Jim Crow came into play. And so as soon as the federal government of the United States said that we are now going to, let's say, be equal, right, as much as we can be, and, you know, give freedom of rights and voting and everything we can do, the states said, well, you know, we have various rights as states. We do not have to listen to the federal government wholly and completely. So we are going to pass, and they did not necessarily all the time call it like the Jim Crow laws, right? That's a nickname. But they passed various laws within the states and local, bureaucracies in order to enforce more of this racial segregation, right? And so this individual states started to pass all of these laws in order to really kind of impede and block progress as much as possible. Because, you know, from their perspective, they had, you know, so many years of slavery and they were benefiting from it, right, and the economic prosperity that stemmed from it. And then, you know, suddenly with like a snap of the fingers almost, right, not obviously, you know, it took more years than that, but for the sake of argument, right, snap of the fingers, Civil War happened, and suddenly they are being told by the federal government, no, you cannot have slavery, you cannot be racist anymore, and this and that. So obviously they're fighting back against that, right? There's a push and pull balance to this. And so we start having these state legislatures after Reconstruction pass laws that will be enforced all the way up until the Civil Rights era movement, which will be for our lecture for the next time around. And we start getting segregation in theaters, buses, trains, streetcars, schools, prisons, parks, you know, restrooms, restaurants, etc. All thanks to Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, where the U.S. Supreme Court firmly decided the quote-unquote separate but equal ruling for public facilities was constitutional. So what this means was that starting in 1896, all the way into the decades up until the civil rights movements, and finally when we got, Brown v. Board of Education. But for decades, we had legalized segregation in the country. And so whites and blacks were legally segregated as long as, quote unquote, they were separate but equal. What does that mean? Intrinsically, that means that you could have white restaurants, black restaurants, but intrinsically they had to be of equal, stature, right? They had to be equally, maintained, clean, have the same type of food, etc. In reality, of course, right, the kind of disparity between the quality was apparent. And so over the decades, that obviously did not play out as idealistically as, it initially was envisioned to be. This is a great video, how Southern socialites rewrote Civil War history. And so now that we're kind of talking about that post-Civil War life and Jim Crow coming into play, this is a great video by Vox, showcasing and detailing some old, Southerner history books, right? Let's say he pulls up the history book of Georgia. I think it was a history book from the 1950s, 1960s, something like that. And in it is a complete revisionist history, right? Saying that, well, back in the day, whites and blacks were frolicking through the meadows and people were happy and life was good and grand. It's just kind of this very BS, grandiose version of whatever happened in the past. And people were teaching that for decades. That's because the local and state legislatures said it's okay for you to, teach these type of books. And actually in the code, and they go through this in the video, in some of the states, they were actually saying that we will not pass any, let's say, educational material for the schools if it, let's say, talks ill of the Confederate flag or the Confederacy or the South or any of this, right? Like there was very stringent requirements. So you can just obviously tell the Southern states are really pushing, right, their agenda on this. And we talked about this a little bit, last time, and so there was some remnants of this because of land reform and, let's say, people having housing issues. And so I just wanted to touch up on this once again. So, after the Civil War, one of the greatest, let's say, possessions that a family can have to grow wealth over time is land, is property, is real estate. That's how the majority of wealth gets passed on from one generation to another one. And so the Southern legislatures definitely understood this, right? And they did not want them to gain as much equity and wealth as they otherwise would have. And so they start coming up with these ingenious land reforms, such as sharecropping and crop liens, where essentially from both systems, in some various forms, they are giving African American families land, but as like rental land. They are, let's say, giving them all of the tools they need to toil the land and farm, but on credit, and knowing that they cannot pay it back because the land would be too small to make enough income to pay back loans. And so this starts this very long process that continues throughout the 1900s, and we're even seeing the ramifications of that today, of housing issues, right, in the black community, and how at certain points of time, just like this, and we'll see other examples for the next lecture, how various reform is used to essentially keep the African American real estate / equity growth at a minimum as much as possible. So if you keep them as renters, they're not going to grow wealth, because renting, you don't grow wealth at all. And so this is a very kind of early on insidious plan. Post-Reconstruction, we see disenfranchisement, right, in various forms. And so after the Reconstruction era, thanks to all of those wonderful amendments that we had in the Constitution, the South was trying to obviously block it as much as possible and prevent them from voting as well, because voting is one of the single greatest, let's say, powers that you have as an American citizen and as a collective, right? You can vote people into office, out of office, you can change things. And so after the 15th Amendment was passed and the right to vote was given, Southern whites attempted other methods to prevent all of these voting. So you have to keep it into context. In the southern states, right in the middle of the Civil War and slightly afterwards, the main population demographic of the South was something along the lines of the totality of the South was around 9 million individuals, and around 4 to like 4.2, 4.3 million of those individuals were African American. So a huge percentage, right? Obviously, almost half. And so it was, it was seen as the great threat, the fact that they can now vote. And so the Southerners, and especially the southern states, were feeling that, well, now all of our voting rights are going to be gone. All of our voting power in Congress is going to be shot. And so we have to do something to kind of counterbalance this. It's all a game of cat and mouse. It's all a game of chess and power. And so they started to implement things like physical intimidation and threats by having employers potentially threaten to fire you if you were going to go out and vote. Eventually, they instituted things like poll taxes. You had to pay a fee to vote. Now, for many people that are struggling at the time with work and feeding their families, etc., you don't want to pay an extra fee to go vote, right? It's just another disincentive of you voting. Finally, they had literacy tests. This comes into play with our last lecture where, remember I was talking about the Freedmen's Bureau? How they were the peacekeepers and how they were building thousands of schools in the South, right, to build up literacy. And so this was a direct kind of very similar conversation, because the southern states starts to implement literacy tests, asking complex like legal questions, having you read a passage of the Constitution in like Old English, which, God help anyone who needs to do that, and, describe what it means. Or let's say simpler sentences, and just kind of say, where is the subject in this sentence, or, whatever. And so anybody that was illiterate could not go and vote if the local state had literacy tests. And so, from every single one of these kind of stacking up on top of each other, you can now see how hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people were disenfranchised, right? They had the right to vote taken away from them, or heavily made as a heavy disincentive for them. But there was one sort of caveat. And so as the southern states are implementing these various laws to block the black vote, they cannot intrinsically within the legislation say poll taxes and literacy tests and all of these different things are only against black people, because the constitutional amendments are stripping all of that language, right? So once again, from a federal top-down level, that was stripped and solved. But from a state level, they're like, okay, what do we do? Because after they passed all of these laws, it also was disenfranchising some of their poor white farmers who were illiterate as well, and who did not have enough money for poll taxes. Poverty by itself knows no race or color. And so a lot of their own folks were getting disenfranchised. So they came up with an ingenious thing called the grandfather clause, which stated that if your ancestors could vote before the Civil War, then you did not have to pass the reading test, right? You kind of were grandfathered in. And so this allowed for many more white people who could not read to say, oh, well, my grandpappy or my dad was able to vote before the Civil War, before all these amendments were passed, et cetera, and all these literacy tests, so I can go vote. And so, this was a way for them to kind of backtrack and solve this new kind of error, right, or problem that they had caused for themselves. And there was something that started here, which was the white primaries. These were elections to select white candidates for public office, banning African Americans from attending. And so in the last lecture, we also saw on the slide with carpetbaggers and scallywags, we saw that the African American community in the Reconstruction was truly pushing for their own to get into public office, because one of the greatest change you can make is vote en masse and get your own people into public office to, change the system from the inside. That is the crux of our governmental, bureaucracy, right? That's how we function as a society. And so, as a reaction to that, now we have white primaries. They want to get their own folks into office, right? Well, even more so because most of them were white anyways, but they wanted to continue that trend, and with the understanding that the new people in power and in charge would, try to keep up this sort of disenfranchisement mentality here. And so we have so many of these types of segregation scenes throughout the U.S., right? Virginia Beach, colored only. We, the pupils of this school, don't want Negroes in our school, right? We won't go to school with them. Strike against integration, right? And so this is a real issue, right, in the South at the time, especially as integration is, potentially up for grabs. Obviously, segregation is still there, but conversations of, breaking up segregation were always at the forefront. And so you had advocates on the other side, clearly. And during this day and age of Jim Crow, I would probably say during the late Reconstruction towards the Jim Crow era, we had a number of kind of the great, during this period of time, the great four African-American leaders, right? These intellectual powerhouses that were offering their intellect and ingenuity and understanding of the situation, and hopefully giving a solution of how, let's say, the community could get themselves into a much better, let's say, economic and social position within the United States. Because at the time, and let's be real about this, the situation was not, the best, right? They were just getting out of the ramifications of slavery. During Reconstruction, trying to gain literacy, trying to go into the workforce and jobs and farming, right? Like they're just starting. And so all of these theories start to come out. First one being Booker T. Washington, very famous individual. He was an educator, author, advisor to even the presidents of the United States, visiting them with dinner, right, at the White House on numerous occasions. And he advocated, and his main policy was that the community should advocate economic freedom / independence more than anything else. So his argument was an economic one, saying that through hard work and business ownership, one could elevate themselves, their family, and therefore their community. And so as you and your community and your family are elevating your status economically, eventually society must contend with you, right? Because you are a main player in that society. And so he said that you could not fight racism head on, or at least it is not the most effective thing to do. And so we had to prove our worth through economic means, right? And so he was essentially saying, look, we're not going to fix the racist mindsets of people within a few years. And so the only main thing that we can do, or like the most effective thing that we can do as a community, is to focus on ourselves, our own businesses, our education, and uplift ourselves economically, right? Get more work, save money, buy property, etc. So that was the economic argument. Webb Du Bois was another intellect, arguably even more influential than even Booker T. Washington towards the later days. He was sort of like a Renaissance man himself, sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, pan-Africanist, editor, writer, etc., extraordinaire, right? But he was advocating for equality within society. And so instead of Booker T. Washington's kind of slow burning, economic progression throughout life, Webb Du Bois was saying, no, we need equality, and we need it now, right? We have to fight tooth and nail, politically, economically, socially, at every single turn, because racism is a very dynamic and breathable, right, issue, right? And so similar to how, let's say, a forest fire, or let's say, I don't know, a tumor in the body or something, Webb Du Bois wanted to go in and check it as fast as possible, right, and stop it from spreading. So in his mind, this was a consistent battle that you needed to, undergo. And so he was chastising Washington for being too lenient and complacent and not extreme enough. So essentially, I would suppose Booker T. Washington's advocation was more kind of changing the system from the inside. Webb Du Bois's, argument was yes, we live within the system, but we have to be far more aggressive with our, let's say, dissatisfaction and with our, change that we want to implement. And so Mr. Washington and Du Bois, right, side by side, great powerhouse intellects. And there's so many works that they wrote about these various issues and others. They were heralded as the kind of community leaders, right, for a long time, right, for these decades. I myself went to Sequoia National Park recently, and out of random, I was walking through the open, expansive, forests. And so here, and I'll get my pointer, but here, as I'm walking, I saw this little sign. There's the Booker T. Washington tree, right? This enormous, ginormous sequoia tree. And so that was just a lovely, nice surprise because I was going through some of the slide work as I was in Sequoia. And so definitely, if you have the time, go to Sequoia National Park. And if you can find the Booker T. Washington's tree, send me a photo. I'd love to see it. Oh, yeah. And then there's me. This is the bottom of a sequoia tree that it fell down with all of the roots. Absolutely enormous, breathtaking views. If you are a fan of camping and traveling like I am, definitely go see it. It's worth your time. Here are two videos on Booker T. Washington, but the right-hand one is more of Booker T. Washington versus Webb Du Bois, right, and their rivalry and their political ideological differences. And so definitely a good watch, only a couple minutes per, so it's not going to, take up too much of your time, but it definitely wraps everything up into a nice context for you. The next two great leaders that we have are Marcus Garvey and A. Philip Randolph. Garvey is probably the third most kind of famous individual of the four. Mr. Randolph kind of ends up tapering off in popularity throughout the years, but Marcus Garvey is still a fascinating individual. Not an American himself. He's actually Jamaican. He was an activist and, an entrepreneur, a very clever orator as well. And he was advocating for something called Pan-Africanism. I believe we spoke about this before, but I'll kind of discuss it again. So Pan-Africanism is the belief or concept that all of the black people around the world are part of one collective group, right? One collective community. And you can put this, beginning suffix into any other types of names, right? Like Pan-Germanism, all the Germans in the world. I don't know what else. Pan-Irishism, right? All of the Irish of the world. But you get the point. And so he was advocating for this large, collective mindset, right? All of the black folks around the world are part of one group, one culture, one people. And so he was protesting white imperialism and racism in the United States, citing that African Americans were forced out of their lands initially, and their ancestors were forced out of the lands of Africa and brought over here in chains, right? So all of this horrific life that they were living was not of their doing. It was not their fault. And so he was even advocating at the very extreme ends of it. So Marcus Garvey was looking at the lay of the land and just saying, listen, life here is pretty, difficult right now. Why don't all African Americans end up just leaving the United States in favor of going to Africa to start a better life for themselves? And so he wanted to resurrect this kind of new state in Africa for all of these people to go back and live their life and kind of resurrect their African culture and their connection to their ancestral homeland again. Interestingly enough, Marcus Garvey did not mention publicly a few different things, which I find interesting. During that conversation of African Americans leaving for Africa, he actually himself owned a couple of the shipping companies, right, and the transportation companies and docks, right, on the ocean. And so I think he would have benefited financially a lot if this had happened. Also, he very early on automatically just said that he would be the new president of this so-called utopia if it were to happen. And there's photographs of him sitting in a carriage, right, in kind of military dress, right, in kind of very like nice military uniform, kind of just saying, I'm the president of this new hypothetical nation. And so as much as, I obviously appreciate a lot of what Marcus Garvey had to bring forth as far as Pan-Africanism and some the intellectual conversations there. Some of the other stuff I call into questionable suspicion. So he's definitely an interesting character, that's for sure. And then A. Philip Randolph is the final one, and also a civil rights movement leader. His main, let's say, solution to all of these problems were that African Americans should predominantly start joining labor unions, because only through unionization could the community band together, right, and have more rights as they are working through all of these segregation and racism issues. And so he criticized Washington for being too relaxed on segregation. He accused Du Bois of being too concerned with the upperclassmen of blacks and being too ambivalent to the working class of African Americans, and considered Garvey a curious oddity destined to be forgotten. I find that absolutely hilarious, right? The intellectual battles between the intellects, right? It's interesting. And so, he was really focused on the working class. I believe he was reading a lot more kind of communistic manifestos at the time, right? Getting some of that additional perspective of the working class, right? And the proletariat. And so that kind of fed into some of his choices for the labor unions. So here's Mr. Marcus Garvey and Philip Randolph. I can't remember if I have... Yeah, okay, so I did not end up putting a photo. I will after this. But the photo of Marcus Garvey in that military garb that I spoke of earlier, it's a sight to see. But I believe they actually put it in this video that I put up here. So Marcus Garvey in this biography, right? Only a few minutes long from the History Channel, but definitely put things into perspective as far as, his viewpoints and, what Pan-Africanism, solutions he had, and how he was critiquing others and was critiqued by others. So very interesting few minutes if you have the time to watch it. Migrations, ghettos, and agency. So let's talk about the Great Migration. We'll talk about ghettos, and we'll kind of move forward into the later parts of the lecture. So what is known as, and there's a couple of different versions of this, but in terms of African American community history, the Great Migration is known as this large movement of around 6 million African Americans from the rural South to other urban areas of the U.S., into the North, the Northeast, West, Midwest, etc. And so as Jim Crow was really firing up in the South, as you might imagine, most African American families told themselves, hell no. Why are we going to stay here, right? The states are just doing their absolute best to put us down. And so, they rightfully just got up and left. And they said, well, let's go to another state. Hopefully we'll have better treatment there. And so they started to move, especially hearing that there are more industrial opportunities from them in these larger cities that are popping up. So maybe they can get work in other sectors. Famously, some of the Ford companies, right, that were building the early Model T Ford cars, Ford himself was very famous for giving equal opportunities to whites and blacks and giving same pay for white and black. And so many people actually were funneling to get work at these Ford Motor Company jobs because the pay was good. And they were kind of going in en masse, right, to try to get those lucrative jobs. And so as this Great Migration was unfolding, the major cities of the U.S. started to see a demographic shift. And so if you could imagine, let's say, I don't know, Chicago, let's say. Chicago is pretty metropolitan and diverse with, let's say, all of these different types of groups that we've discussed thus far, whether it's Irish, Italian, or Eastern European, etc. Right? We had Poles, we had Spaniards, so many different types, and now we have huge migrations of African Americans as well. So the demographics started to shift within the cities. And so in the 20th century, what we end up getting in conjunction with, right, because the Supreme Court said that segregation is legal, we start to get in many of these cities actual city policies and suburban development planning of the cities, and some kind of construction of whatever a ghetto would be. And so the slide, the video right here that I posted up, the creation of urban ghettos, kind of details some of that, where in the 1900s, they lay out this enormous map of the city, and they start to color in different, shades, different parts of the city depending on the demographics. So for instance, if this certain part or section of the city were mostly white or all white, they will mark it green, right, such as safe, and the value goes up. If it is a very mixed neighborhood, they will mark it, let's say, yellow, right, or orange or something like that, where it's like it's mixed, and so the value of property goes down. Or if it was mostly black communities, they would mark it red as undesirable. And they would try to force them into communities and coerce them into communities where mostly it was just rental properties, right? So you're not buying and owning a home for yourself and building equity, you're renting. And so, all of this, or let's say systemic, right, issues were happening throughout the communities. And so every single city wanted to kind of separate themselves into these kind of different parts of the living situations. And so we start to create, to get these formation of ghettos, right, or quote unquote ghettos. The book gets into it a little bit, going back as far as where the origin of the term ghetto came from. It came from Cannaregio, Italy, where Jews were living in an impoverished section of the city. And the city itself purposefully sent all the Jews to this specific side of the city and said, you can only live here. And so the ghetto formed. And, especially they were having economic issues, right, within that territory as well. And so these areas of the city start to slowly become more impoverished than other areas of the city, because the city itself and the city planners and the people within the city all are either actively or implicitly collaborating to establish this kind of hierarchical tier, right, of difference. These are the good communities, these are the bad communities. And so over time, that has a bunch of different rippling effects, right? It's not as simple as that. There's very complex issues that go on to this types of conversations. And this is like this can be an entire class, right, on like city planning, segregation, if you want to go into real estate and stuff. But, just so many more factors that kind of stem from this. And so here are three excellent videos that I found. So life, migrations, and hidden meanings. So on the bottom left, we have, this is from, I believe, Milwaukee, if I remember correctly. The video of what's it like living in the worst city to be black in America, quote unquote. And so this stems from how much police incarceration, for how much police interaction they have, how much incarceration they have, how the housing rates are, right? And so they go through various interviews of folks that are living in the city at the time and getting their experiences and thoughts on the subject. And so a very fascinating and eye-opening video by PBS. In the middle, from Vox, why African Americans left the South in droves, right? This is talking about that great migration of 6 million individuals, right, leaving. And so the demographics of the United States completely starts to change. And so as the demographics are starting to change, we have cities and people kind of pushing back a little bit with changing their city policies and their planning policies. And the reason that this kind of real estate conversation comes into fruition is because, once again, with my kind of like simplistic explanation of federal, state, and kind of societal social change, right, in nations or societies. Federal government passed all of their laws to make everyone equal. Great. The states, in the South especially, really pushing back. As they're moving into all of these other sectors and areas of the country, some of those states are not as, let's say, the Deep South, having statewide levels of poll taxes and literacy tests and whatnot, but at a social level, right? What they can do that is not blatantly on paper, quote unquote, racist, but low key, is that you're creating all of these real estate, divisions, right? And we have historical evidence of this, right? This is not a, some type of just theory, right, that we're coming out of from the wind. We do have historical maps of the city, even Los Angeles, of different shadings of the communities based off of demographics. And so, it is definitely a part of the history that's interesting to study. The bottom right-hand side is from the This Is America video, right, by Childish Gambino. And I like this video because it breaks down and details the entire wardrobe and all of the dress and everything that they do with their hands and movements in the video. And it's absolutely fascinating because Childish Gambino made so many callbacks to racism, the Confederacy, blackface, all of these issues in Jim Crow especially, within his video. And it's fascinating because they go in and they kind of pause things, right, and give you kind of side-by-side comparisons. And so it's a great watch if you have a few minutes of time. And if you're naturally just a fan of the This Is America video, hopefully maybe they'll show you a couple things that you just did not notice before. So some of my final thoughts on the Jim Crow era. So after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, right, the community obviously tried to deal with so many issues. They tried to deal with, forceful or coerced assimilation, whitewashing, a lot of the migration movements if things were not working out too great, socioeconomic, issues that they were dealing with locally, or even if they moved over there as well. Counteracting to this, we have many legal and civil protests. We have different leaders politically, like those major four leaders we talked about, that were trying to advocate for change in different ways. We had such a tumultuous, few decades, right? And that, once again, that push and pull, right? The United States has such a polarizing history, and most people forget that the U.S. has, as far as like how old it is, has been under slavery longer than it has not been under slavery. So it's still a very kind of real subsidiary part of the culture, right, and the subconscious. As we're going to be discussing for the later section, eventually by the 80s, 90s, 2000s, all of this starts to change in a certain way. We do start to get some good things, well, potentially. So we'll talk about that in the next lecture. But we start to see some good things. Let's say with the formation of rap and hip hop, and various music that they are trying to reclaim their agency, right? To make this entire new genre of music that is just consistently, even today, top of Spotify and top on all the music record chains. And you'll be driving by and seeing a bunch of white kids in a car, and they're like bumping, Future, right? Or they're bumping like some like hardcore, rap or hip hop. It definitely, the introduction of all this music in the last like 20-30 years, definitely was speaking to a lot of the hardships, a lot of themes of quote unquote coming up from the hood, culturally trying to spread their inner city lifestyle and realities to these suburbs. And so as these communities that were forcibly kind of put there from like real estate sections, right, as some of them start to deteriorate socioeconomically and turn into quote unquote ghettos, over time in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, we have some like rappers and music artists coming out, right, and talking about the hardships. Ice Cube was one of the first ones, right, I remember, of Snoop Dogg, and a few others. And so this was kind of trying to embrace the history and rechange the narrative and flip it around. Now the counter argument to this would be, let's say in today's day and age, The counter argument to this would be where, yes, it is retaining agency and kind of regaining a lot of the conversation. However, does ghetto music, the quote unquote ghetto music or rap hip hop, or having, you know, half naked like dancers in the background and like having all of this like just craziness, right? Does it perpetuate more of a negative stereotype, right? Or is it, you know, does it have more bad than good potentially in society? That's going way too deep into like film and music theory and critiques and sociological stuff. So I'll leave that for those departments. But it's an interesting counter argument, right? To at least, you know, bring up and be mindful of. But, you know, as far as African Americans go, as the community in general, like Native Americans, they were struggling and still struggle with acculturation and assimilation, right? How to balance your community's history and your religion and your way of speech and the way that you do things, right? Your culture. How do you balance that with the greater, let's say, culture of whatever the U.S. is turning into, right? That salad theory, the salad bowl theory, right? Or the sometimes melting pot. And the great irony here is that, and I always tell this to people, especially if you ever visit Washington, D.C., the capital of our nation. I visited there a few years ago. I was at UCLA for my undergrad, and I was chosen to be part of this wonderful contingent of California students to go to Congress and lobby for better, you know, student representation from the UCs, and also to try to counteract the raising of tuition rates, right, for students. That's a whole nother conversation. But essentially, I went to Washington, D.C., and I saw the beautiful monuments. It's a really lovely, beautiful city. And you could just tell how much history there was in it. But even as I was walking through there in my early years, but especially as I'm thinking about it now, right, for my final thoughts, you know, the United States of America was literally built up as a nation from the hard blood, sweat, and tears of African Americans, right, from slavery. A lot of the monuments that I saw, although beautiful and grandiose, right, were built from slave labor. And so it's a very mixed and ironic history that the group in America that built up the U.S. so much in so many ways was being treated like second-class citizens for so long. You know, obviously there's been much great strides from, let's say, Jim Crow eras till today. Obviously there are still issues prevalent that need to be fixed and addressed, and like what Du Bois says, consistently challenged against like a wildfire, right? But, you know, I like to be on the optimistic side. And so things are definitely better now than they were 100 years ago. Things are better now than they were 50 years ago. So I'm hopeful that within 50 years from now, 100 years from now, things will be even better. And as that generational sort of sociological kind of societal level of change starts to permeate more and more and more, hopefully we can get to a place where we don't even have to talk about, you know, some of the, you know, kind of current level, let's say, racism or atrocities, because hopefully one day there will not be any current levels of it. And we could just focus on a more kind of historical mindset of it. So that's the ultimate goal. How we're going to get there or when, I'm not sure right now, but I'm excited and hopeful for change. But that is my end of the lecture. And here's my wonderful meme. Your brain after picking B 4 times in a row. Wrong. It was a funny meme I found. But thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate it. The annotated bibliography is going to be due pretty soon, so keep your eyes on that. The quiz, our weekly quiz, is going to be due. If you did not receive my announcement, please watch the announcement via Canvas. And so thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you for the next lecture. Take care.